Hey there, I'm G, and welcome to the next level, and you're opening up G's Treasure Chest, the series where we'll dive into some of the more rare and uncommon games in my collection, see what they're all about, and give some final thoughts on their place in history. If there's one superhero that I'd say has been treated quite well in the world of video games, it's our beloved savior of New York City, villain of the Daily Bugle, Peter Parker himself, the often spectacular, but always amazing, Spider-Man. Now, good old Spidey is no stranger to the world of Sega, including a great game from Sega themselves across their 8 and 16-bit systems known as Spider-Man, or Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, an arcade game that Sega sadly never gave a home port, and a few efforts from Acclaim, or LJN, on both Genesis and Super NES. These were a collection of hits and misses, including their great yet quite challenging beat-em-up Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. But there is one Spider-Man Sega game that many people to this day don't know exists, and has become quite the rarity. So let's get ready to sling our way across the rooftops and dig into Sega's quietly released effort for today's game from the treasure chest, The Amazing Spider-Man Web of Fire on the 32X. Spider-Man Web of Fire was released on the 32X in January of 1996 and was the final game to be released for the console in North America. It was developed by Blue Sky Software, which should be a familiar name to Genesis fans, as they were the team behind Sega's iconic Vector Man games, the first two Jurassic Park Genesis games, the criminally underrated Ren and Stimpy's Invention, as well as one of my favorite games on the console, Desert Demolition, starring the Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote. In fact, shortly before the game's release, Sega announced that they were discontinuing the 32X, which probably froze any sort of marketing that Sega had planned for this game. With no doubt a very limited print run, Web of Fire has become one of the rarest, if not the rarest, Spider-Man video game in history. So, how did they treat my favorite superhero ever? Well, let's sling those webs and find out. The story behind Web of Fire is that the terrorist group Hydra and its new enforcers have trapped New York City under a giant electrical grid. They even captured Daredevil, the bastards! It's up to America's beloved web slinger to save Daredevil, take out the generators, and defeat each of the new enforcers. Right away, that's a bit of a letdown as a kid, as the more well-known villains of Spider-Man like Dr. Octopus, Carnage, or not even the Sandman, they're nowhere to be found in this game. It just feels like the 32X game got the B-team of supervillains here. So let's get right into the game. Web of Fire sticks true to side-scrolling Spider-Man roots. You can shoot webs, punch enemies, and web sling your way across each of the 5 stages. Basically, get to the end of the stage, beat the boss, destroy the generator, and move on. Right away, you'll see that the graphics, while quite colorful, don't really look that much better than the Genesis game, aside from the motion-captured CG models. And speaking of those CG models, while they look impressive, aside from Spidey himself, they don't animate well at all. With just a little bit more animation, Web of Fire could have been a lot more appealing to the eye. I mean, take a look at Dragon Man here, the first level boss. He looks impressive when he's standing still, but when he starts moving, you can see how little animation he really has, especially when he jumps. It just looks kinda cheap. And the sound isn't really noteworthy either. The music's not bad, but it does sting of that typical Genesis twang, with some pretty weak sound effects that were definitely reused from other Blue Sky games. When the human enemies die, they make the same death yell that Dr. Grant did in the Jurassic Park game. Spidey moves really fast in this game. In fact, he moves a little too fast for the screen to catch up. So if you're moving and grooving and you're not really paying attention, you could fall, or even run into a hazard or right into an enemy. It reminds me of Bubsy and how he moves too fast for the screen in his game, but Web of Fire is thankfully marginally better about that. The other mechanic that kinda irks me in this game is how Spider-Man has a limit to how much web he can use, which includes when you're web slinging across the stage. I get it, I understand why it would make sense for Spidey to be limited on his web power, like the aforementioned Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, but I guess I got spoiled by other games like Maximum Carnage where you have unlimited web to use. Running out of web thankfully doesn't happen too often in this game, as power-ups are pretty plentiful, but when it does, especially during boss fights when you need to use your web, running out really sucks. And while refills are plentiful, health packs are definitely not, and this game is quite tough, so best to remember where those health packs are because you definitely will need them. Once you rescue Daredevil in the first stage, you can pause the game and summon him if you have enough Daredevil tokens. He basically acts as a smart bomb to take out all the enemies on the screen, and there will be times when you'll need him, so use him wisely. You know what? I'll say it. Why haven't we gotten a Daredevil game? I'd play it. Controlling Spidey feels about right, but he can be a bit unresponsive at times, especially when you're fighting enemies. It feels like you have to make multiple button presses for a simple 3-punch combo. It's best to just hit them with the web shot before taking them out. You can even do a running dive kick, which will take out most enemies in one hit, but I found it difficult to pull off even when gaining enough momentum. Sometimes Spidey just won't do it at all, and it feels awkward. Meanwhile, the enemies in this game are hit sponges. That is when your attacks don't go straight through them or miss entirely due to Spidey's low attack range. And when you're dealing with these flying drones, which are the most annoying enemy in the game, if you're too close, your web shot will go right through them. You have to be in a specific range to hit them. However, I will say that slinging through the stages does feel cool and satisfying, as it should be in any Spider-Man game. Though in some stages, especially in the first stage, it feels like you could just keep slinging all the way from left to right and not worry about the rest of the stage. And yeah, it feels authentic, it feels like Spider-Man when you're slinging, but it just takes the challenge away. Which brings me to what I feel is the game's biggest flaw, the level design. Most of the levels are a straight point A to point B stage. It's not like Sonic when you're rewarded for going as fast as you can, as you'll need to pick up power-ups and navigate your way through mazes as you go in certain stages. Like I mentioned before, you get halted when Spidey starts moving and grooving and run into things. It's like the routine is run, beat up enemy, run, beat up another enemy, repeat, web sling a bit, and hopefully there's some ground beneath you, run, beat up enemy, repeat. It gets tedious real quick. And the graphics can get disorienting in some levels too. Look at how the parallax scrolling jumps up and down as you move forward. I don't know about you guys, but it just trips me out. I found myself just web slinging past this stage to get through it quicker, but that's no fun. And then you have stages like the electrical maze of stage 2 that just don't make any sense. Like you have to rise to the top by web slinging and climbing your way and avoiding the traps. It gives you a very tiny window to safely avoid them. And this wouldn't be so bad if Spider-Man didn't feel so awkward when transitioning the walls. Sometimes you can even get stuck on hazardous corners and die, which is very aggravating. Basically, you climb up, avoid the traps, take some cheap hits from enemies, especially on the ceiling, cross walls, drop down, climb back up, and repeat until you get to the end. It feels like it just goes on forever. Oh, by the way, those flying drones I mentioned, they're at their worst here. I will say the fire plant stage is very, very cool. The graphics actually look quite nice here, and the fire effect is pretty cool, although the enemies are at their cheapest in this stage. I really like stage 4 when you climb up the chamber. It does show off some pretty cool graphical effects like these revolving piston heads, and the enemies seem to get a little bit smarter. It's just unfortunate that you may not care by getting up to this point. You might have given up well before this far. And if you do happen to make it to the final boss, you'll have to fight all the bosses all over again and escape the headquarters before it explodes, and you have very little time to make it out alive. And while I won't spoil it, let's just say the ending of this game feels just like the rest of the game. Unfortunately rushed. It may sound like I'm burying Web of Fire, but it's only because I feel like this game should have been way more than it wound up becoming. In the end, it's really not all that bad. You can easily tell when playing through it that Blue Sky, they had a vision of making a great Spider-Man game, but when Sega basically cast it away to 32X, I bet the passion behind it just kinda died. And while it does have moments of greatness, that's why it disappoints me so much. It's far from the worst Spider-Man game I've ever played, or even the worst on a Sega console, but we are talking about the final game of the console's library, the game that sealed the fate of the system. You hope for it to go out with a bang and not a whimper. Spider-Man Web of Fire's intentions were great, but unfortunately, it takes its place in being the perfect analogy for the 32X. So much potential, but very little faith behind it. So, now that you know more about Spider-Man Web of Fire, the big questions. Is it worth playing today? And I say, only the most diehard fans will probably get good enjoyment out of it. It's really not that bad, but it's too frustrating at times otherwise. Is it worth owning today? Considering its current value, absolutely not. Only if you're a big-time Spidey fan or a Sega nutcase like me. Yeah. But is it an interesting piece of gaming history? Definitely. It really makes you wonder what really could have been of this game if maybe the 32X had performed better, or if Blue Sky had more time for development, or perhaps both? Who knows? But I want to know, what are your thoughts about Spider-Man Web of Fire? Have you played it? Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? Or what are your thoughts on Spider-Man and video games in general? Let me know in the comment section below what you think. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at G2TheNextLevel. I'm G, I'll see you on the next level, and until then, the treasure chest is closed.